You're listening to
Catholic Sprouts,
the daily podcast for Catholic kids that strives to plant seeds of faith. Hey there, Sprouts. Today is Thursday, May 2nd, 2019. This week on the Catholic Sprouts podcast, we are still celebrating Easter, and we are celebrating many of the great saints that show us what it means to truly be an Easter people, to live in the joy and next to, beside the great risen Lord Jesus Christ. We have already looked at St. Catherine of Siena and seen that anything is possible when you believe in Jesus Christ. We looked at St. George, both the real person and the legend, and reminded ourselves that we need not fear Satan. Next, yesterday we looked at St. Joseph the worker. We reminded ourselves that there is dignity in work and that St. Joseph is a powerful intercessor for us. Today, we are going to look at a lesser known saint who has a feast day today, and that is Saint Zoe. Now, Saint Zoe was an early Christian. She lived in a part of Asia that we call Asia Minor, and she was a slave. At the time, she was married to a man, and they had 2 sons. They converted to Christianity, but their master had not converted to Christianity. He still practiced belief in the pagan gods, many gods, to which they offered various kinds of sacrifices. However, St. Zoe and her husband had really been falling in love with Jesus Christ and the principles of Christianity. At the birth of their second son, the owner, the master of St. Zoe and her husband, offered food as a sacrifice to the gods in thanksgiving for the birth of their son, who, of course, would be another slave to this man. St. Zoe and her husband, however, refused to eat the food that had been sacrificed to the gods, and therefore their master knew that they had been converted to Christianity. He tortured them, trying very hard to force them to renounce their faith in Jesus Christ, which of course they refused to do. Ultimately, they were thrown into the furnace and killed along with their 2 infant sons. Now, I know, unfortunately, the story of St. Zoe and her husband and her sons who are killed for their faith is not a unique story. Many Christians in the early days were martyred for their faith. And many of them, like St. Zoe, her husband, and her children, died in horrible ways. And yet they willingly faced death. Now, why is this, and what can it remind us about what it means to be an Easter people? Well, they willingly faced death because they did not fear death. Most people are very afraid of death, and a big part of that fear is because they don't know what comes next. Death is sort of like the great mystery. What happens after we die? No one dies and comes back. Well, except for one person, of course, and that person is Jesus Christ. Now, because of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, we know what comes next after we die. We know that we weren't made for this world, that this world is full of suffering and pain, that we were made for eternal paradise in heaven with Jesus Christ. Therefore, we don't need to fear death. This is why St. Zoe and her husband refused to renounce their faith, why they were willing to die rather than eat food that had been sacrificed to the gods, because they knew that what comes next is better. And so, Sprouts, here's my challenge for you today. Pray through the intercession of St. Zoe, an early Christian martyr who was a slave and died because she would not renounce her faith. Pray that she, through her intercession, can help you also not fear death and instead keep your eyes focused on heaven. That's it for Catholic Sprouts today. We'll be back tomorrow, but until then, continue to grow in your faith and truly sprout into the beautiful creation that God intended you to be. one final word to the grown-ups. Thank you so much for listening to the Catholic Sprouts podcast. I would like to invite you to join a special Facebook group just for those that listen to the Catholic Sprouts podcast. We will use this group to connect, to share resources around that week's theme, and simply celebrate raising future saints. To find the direct link to the Facebook group, simply check the notes for this podcast episode.